the scariest thing you've ever seen in your life that you can't explain? Story 1. About 25 years ago, my now former wife and I were caretaking a house. We had been there for several weeks, and we both noticed that we always had that feeling coming up the stairs from the cellar that something was going to grab you as soon as you turned the light switch off. Everything else about the house was normal. We slept with an analog wind-up alarm clock next to the bed, the kind that actually ticks. To set the alarm, you move a tiny third hand to the location on the clock face for the desired time. For example, halfway between 6 and 7 to awaken at 6:30. It's a physical process and there is very little way to get it wrong. We always had the clock set to wake us up at 6 a.m. It was not something we fiddled with on a daily basis. One night, the alarm clock went off at like 2 in the morning. Old school ringing bells. Both my former wife and I woke up absolutely terrified. I saw a small figure maybe 2 feet tall run out of the room. I thought I must have been crazy until my former wife screamed, "Did you just see that thing?" We both described it as some sort of small gremlin. When we looked at the alarm clock, we saw that the alarm hand had been moved from 6 a.m. to 2 a.m. That's the whole story. Scared the out of me. Have no explanation for it. Nothing else ever happened there, but the cellar feeling persisted. Story 2. Once I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. I could see the outline of someone standing there, but when I turned on the light, there was no one there. The door was still slowly closing, as if whoever or whatever had been there was leaving. Even creepier, my Nest fire alarm had illuminated in the corridor, sensing movement, but there was nobody there. Still gives me chills thinking about it. Story 3. Working in a nursing home for years during the night, and everyone always complained of weird stuff like noises on the top floor. I never believe in any of that, so I was always the one going upstairs to do night checks. One night I was changing a resident on that floor with a colleague, and my colleague complained he heard something like people walking. We were in the resident room and I had to go to the cupboard at end of that corridor to get bed sheets. And when I was coming back with the bed sheets, I kept hearing steps and like if someone was touching and opening plastic bags. I was so annoyed and looked outside the room and saw a shadow passing the corridor. The issue is that the shadow was so big, like if literally a person just passed by along with step noises and plastic bags. I freak out so badly and froze completely. I had to call another colleague to come upstairs because I was so scared of coming out of the resident room. Bear in mind that I do not believe in those things, and for 2 years I was always the one doing night checks on the top floor and bottom floor on my own. Never had any problem and never saw something. Since that day, I never went upstairs alone and was always very scared. Story 4. So in college I studied in the UK. I lived in a house with a group of other American students that had stories of the ghost of a girl who passed away while living there. I never believed in any of it, but it was fun to play along. The kitchen had one way in and out, and right after you entered the kitchen to your right was a padlocked door to the cellar where she allegedly lived. I had the only key. We were all a little homesick near Thanksgiving, so decided to do a meal together. This required some creative cooking schedules due to small appliances in the kitchen, so one girl who didn't have class the next day offered to stay up late to get the turkey going. We went into the cellar the first and only time that evening to get larger cooking implements. At 2:04 in the morning, I wake up to my door rattling, like someone was pushing against it. I assumed it was a housemate who just went to the wrong door. About 30 seconds later, when I hear a scratchy female voice softly saying hello every 5 seconds or so. My window was open, and it sounded like it was coming from outside, so I get up to close my window as I assume it's some drunk girl walking back from the pub. I get to the window, and there's no one there. And then I hear, "Hello?" Clear as a bell behind me. My door rattles again and goes silent. I've had night terrors before and hallucinate when I have even a mild fever, so I assume I'm still asleep and lay back down. The next morning at 7 a.m., the girl who's cooking tells me, "I had the creepiest night. At 1:50 I heard footsteps coming up the cellar stairs. Then the door rattled. Then at 2:10 the door rattled again and I heard footsteps coming down." She told me this before I had said anything to anyone about what I'd experienced. Story 5. This isn't my story, it's my uncle's. A bit of backstory, he used to work on the London Underground doing maintenance to the track stock tunnels, etc. Once he went into a tunnel with 2 other colleagues. They'd stopped to do something, and this man said to my uncle like, "Hey, uncle's name, can you show me the way out?" My uncle, thinking it was one of his guys, said, "You know the way out." I think he was so engrossed in his work that he didn't turn around to see this bloke to start with. So this guy says, "I'm so cold." Then my uncle said he immediately felt dead cold and the air around him dropped. Not sure what he meant by that. So my uncle turns round and shines a light on him. My uncle said to me this bloke is what he would call a ghost standing there. He was holding a really old vintage lamp and wearing a really old dirty uniform. He said the feeling he got was so strange as if he knew this bloke was a ghost. The bloke just kept saying over and over again, "I'm so cold. I'm so cold." My uncle eventually said to this guy, "I don't think you're supposed to be here, mate. Can you see a light anywhere?" And he looked dead at my uncle and said, "Can you help me? I'm so cold." I'm unsure if the colleagues came to see who my uncle was talking to, but one of them tried to approach this bloke thinking it was someone in their team playing a joke, and this bloke just disappeared right in front of their eyes. All of them freaked out and ran. They refused to go back into the tunnel. My uncle and two colleagues refused to go down that tunnel again. Some other colleagues have said they've seen this bloke, and he always says how cold he is. My uncle's retired now, but says he thinks of this bloke from time to time. Story 6. When I was 9 years old, I was biking home in the evening. We lived in the countryside up a small mountain. The road from the village was an uphill, a flat section, and then another uphill. The road lights only stretched to the end of the flat section. I was a bit afraid of the dark, so I stopped at the end of the road lights just at the bottom of the last uphill to gather courage to bike the last section home. It was a partial moon, so it wasn't pitch black, and at the end of the uphill I saw a figure walking down towards me. I thought I'd wait until she got closer, as I would feel less afraid to bike in the dark if there was someone else close. But about halfway down the hill, the person walked into a thin shadow of a tree on the road and never came back out. Just disappeared. I stood there for a while trying to figure out what I just saw, and then panicked and biked down to the village and stayed there until my parents came driving and wondered why I never came home. They tried to explain it with stuff like the person might have gone into the woods or something. What they didn't disclose, though, out of fear that I'd never dare to bike home again, was that my father had seen the same thing walking home from work. He had seen her clear as day, walking down the hill for a while. When he looked down for just a second and looked up, she was gone, and there were no footsteps in the fresh snow. I later read a book about local legends, and apparently a lot of people during at least a century have seen her walking down the hill and disappearing halfway down. My youngest daughter loved this story, so we've been on ghost stakeouts, where we buy pizzas and snacks and hang out at the bottom of the hill, listening to the Ghostbusters theme song and try to see the ghost. Story 7. I was riding my bike down a rural road when I was 9, and found a garbage bag filled with red sludge and white sticks. I thought it was blood and bones. But I had a very PG childhood, and I had never even seen pretend blood and bones, so I had nothing to compare to. I told myself it wasn't what I thought it was. After all, why would there be a ripped open garbage bag filled with blood and bones? 2 days later, I thought, look again, and if it is what you think it is, tell a grown-up. I biked back to the area, and it was gone. I am now old and have watched enough to confirm it was blood and bones. Story 8. My grandfather had just died a few days earlier, and my mom was crying one night in our kitchen. I started hugging her. We had a lot of my grandfather's belongings, but there was this broken radio that didn't even have working batteries in it on the table, along with other things like photos and clothes he previously owned. This is the only unexplainable thing I've ever experienced, but while my mom was bawling crying, the radio made a very loud static noise for about a second. We both stared in silence at it. It was eerie. She stopped crying because even she heard it. We both just went to bed after that and haven't spoke of it since. I'd imagine if it was something paranormal, it was my grandfather letting us know he's here, but who knows. Story 9. Around 2003, I was walking home from work in the afternoon and just happened to look up on an overcast day. Parallel to my direction, a meteor burned up, led by a bright burning and leaving black smoke across the whole sky. It made a low-pitched, loud rumbling across the whole sky for the 3 seconds it took to travel that far. Before YouTube, no one would have believed me, much less heard of anyone who saw it. In hindsight, it was wicked cool to see. At the time, I thought I was going to die. I had seen meteor showers. I had never seen one that low, or with any volume. Story 10. My friend and I were driving from a gig we played in Kona, on the big island of Hawaii. We were driving on Saddle Road, one of 2 roads from Kona to the other side of the island to Hilo Town. Saddle Road is known for being a spiritual place and lots of weird things there. This stretch of land is about 40 kilo with no lights or population, just lava rock. We drove over the road about 1 a.m. We were talking stories and having a good time. Then we saw on the side of the road a huge white dog wearing a gold chain staring at us. We passed and asked if we saw the same thing. We were debating about stopping on the side of the road to pick it up. The local legend is that if you see an old lady on the road, you need to pick her up, or something bad will happen. We didn't stop and didn't speak until we got home. I asked another local guy what could that have been. He said it was the goddess Pele's pet. Did some research. Looks like this dog has been seen sporadically since the 1950s. Story 11. Not so scary but unexplainable. At my stepmom's funeral, she was played off with the song I'll Fly Away from my personal CD of the Oh Brother SDTK. On the way home, I got the disc out to play it, and the disc was broken neatly in half in the case. Story 12. I live in the countryside, and when I was a kid, every day I used to go check the chickens that we had in a henhouse in the garden. It was around 8 p.m. in the winter, dark and snow everywhere. I put my shoes on and went outside. Everything went as usual until I saw it. There was somebody standing in front of me in the dark. Or like, I wish it was somebody. That figure was almost 3 meters tall and had red glowing eyes. I told my parents, and until this day, nobody believes me. Few years ago, I found out the previous owner of our house committed suicide in the same place in our garden years before we moved in. Story 13. As a kid, there was a camp that had a lean-to and an old plywood caravan against it a long way out in the Ausbush from the town I grew up in. One school holidays, my friends and I went for a bushwalk and stumbled across it. Didn't look like anyone had been there in months, and we looked in the van. Nothing much but moldy seats and a built-in table. Usual old caravan stuff, so we shut the door because it smelt moldy. As we sat in the shade of the lean-to, we heard the doorknob squeak and start turning. Pretty sure my backpack is still sitting there 35 years later because I dropped it and ran. We all scattered in different directions and met up lower down the road an hour later, and we were all still pale. No way anyone was in that van. No way. Still bothers me to this day. Story 14. Brought home a 3-foot-tall realistic doll my grandparents had, with the intention of fixing it up. I'm scared of dolls, so I put it in a box and put a heavy metal box on top of it. Next morning, the doll was gone. The boxes were still in place, but the thing had disappeared completely. I live in fear. Story 15. I used to go night running pretty late, 11 p.m., 1 a.m., up a valley near my house. At one point, the road I run on goes through an area with cemeteries on both sides and an abandoned Japanese Shinto temple nearby. One night during a run while I was running between the cemeteries, I saw an old Asian lady standing by a bus stop. She said hi in a very slow and deliberate manner and waved at me. I nodded and smiled at her and kept jogging. My turnaround point was about 5 minutes past the bus stop, but when I turned around and ran back the way I came, the woman was gone. No cars or buses had driven past me in either direction, and I didn't see her walking anywhere. She was there when I ran up the road, and she was gone 5 minutes later when I ran down the road. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but later I realized the whole situation seemed very strange. Why was she there so late at night? Where did she go? I still get a chill up my spine remembering the odd way she said hi and waved at me. Needless to say, I changed my running route shortly after that. Story 16. Living in kind of a beat-up neighborhood in the early 2000s. My house had an alleyway behind it, and one night around 3 a.m., I heard the weirdest sound, like laughing, but also moaning. I looked out my window and saw the elderly man standing under a street lamp just staring up at my window. It freaked me the out. He finally kept walking down the alleyway, but man, I never looked out that window at night again. Story 17. I had a dog growing up that was the smartest dog I've ever met. She was like a human trapped in a dog's body. My brother and I found her wandering around our neighborhood after school, and we brought her home. She was beloved. My brother died young. After he died, she would walk slowly in a circle around a plant we had in the living room, letting the leaves that hung down gently rub her back. Every once in a while, she would stop and look up at the plant for a moment, like she saw some kind of apparition floating above the plant. She would get a sad look in her eyes and let out a whimper. I'm convinced she was seeing my brother's ghost watching over us. I really loved that dog. Story 18. I might have something for this. When I was young, probably around 10 or so, maybe younger, I was at a family wedding. It was late in the evening, so a full moon was out and it was getting darker. Me and my cousin, who's a year younger, were swinging on this big metal gate thing outside the venue. It was on the entrance to a very, very big field. We noticed a guy very far into the field who was just glowing and radiating white. I mean, his skin, clothes, everything. I remember us standing there like WTF. Then we tried to get his attention and shout at him. He stopped, looked in our direction, but he stopped right under the full moon and pointed up towards the moon while staring at us. We were just in shock and confusion pretty much. After about 10 seconds of pointing, he carried on walking across the field and just disappeared behind a swing set. Even till this day, I have no idea what that was. I'm hoping it was some costume or something, but sure didn't look like it. Story 19. Okay, so not something I furry saw, but something I was told someone else saw. Here's the story. My ex-GF passed away years ago. Before she passed, me and brother lived together, and my brother had a big pit bull named Max. Max was an awesome dog, and she was a big animal lover, and she knew Max very well. I eventually moved out, he got a GF who had a kid and needed the space. Okay, that's established. Of note, my ex-GF had long blonde hair, was in her 30s, and she was buried in a pink sweater. A few months after she passed, my brother took them all on a vacation and asked me if I could watch the dog, feed him, etc. I said yes, of course. They kept him crated, and the crate was in his GF's daughter's room, kind of a big basement room. I hung out with the dog and eventually had to leave, so I put him back in his crate. I felt bad, but I had to. Before I left, I looked up the sky and said, "Meg, if you're still around, please keep Max company, he's gonna be lonely." So I go home, my brother comes back, whatever. A few months later, I'm talking to his GF, in her 30s, and we're talking about ghost stuff. She tells me that her house is haunted. I'm like, no way, I'm there all the time, I've never seen anything. She explains to me that it seemed to happen out of nowhere. She hadn't seen anything, but her daughter, around 5 or 6 years old, told her that sometimes when Max is barking or freaking out for whatever reason, her daughter tells her she sees a lady about mommy's age with long blonde hair wearing a pink sweater who calms down the dog. I'm pretty sure I invited a ghost in their house, but I'm happy that I did. I wish I could have seen her. Story 20. When I was about 7, I had a rope swing in my backyard. I was obsessed with it and would play on it for hours. One day, just like any other, I was swinging on it, and out the corner of my eye, I spotted an animal. At first, I thought it was a squirrel, but as I turned to look at it, it was much bigger and darker than a squirrel. So I figured it was a stray cat. But as I watched it walk across the yard, it wasn't a cat. It was something I had never seen before. It was all black, had the head of a badger but the body of a squirrel. It was about 2 feet in length and the height of a small dog. I got a little spooked because I figured it was a rabid animal, so I got off the swing and backed away. That's when, in all seriousness, I watched this mystery animal run towards the fence and run right through it. Leaving to hole or damage to the fence, it just phased right through. I sat in awe for a good 3 minutes before I slowly walked inside. Story 21. Cleaning the house after my mom passed away. She loved body spray. I threw away a nearly empty bottle. I found it in the dishwasher a few days later. Story 22. It's not scary but unexplainable. When I was 10, I got into a motorcycle accident. I wasn't driving it. I was walking from school when a motorcycle hit me going full speed. I did see the motorcycle come, but I froze up and couldn't move. When it had hit me, I flew pretty far and remember someone catching me when I fell down. When I got up and looked around, I didn't see anyone, and witnesses told the cops I flew at least 6 feet and fell headfirst on the ground. My head was fine, just had a broken collarbone. Thankfully, my parents believed me when I told them. Story 23. I had a dream when I was about 6 years old. It was of an apartment, and inside was lots of ghosts and horrible, scary creatures. They then dragged me into a room, put me in a bin full of fire. When I turned 10, I moved 200 miles away with my dad to that same apartment from my dream. The fire bin room was my bedroom. That apartment was a literal too, as there were loads of drug addicts, etc. there. Story 24. When I was about 24 or 25, I stopped off at a CVS relatively late at night. On my way inside the store, the parking lot was pretty much empty. But when I came back out, a strange-looking woman was standing in the parking lot. She had this creepy, weird grin on her face, and black eyes. I don't mean bruising around her eyes. Rather, it looked like her eyeballs were made of pure onyx. She just didn't seem human in a way. She stood near my car, watched me get inside, start the engine, etc. She didn't speak to me or try to come closer or anything. She just stared with that freaking weird grin and those black eyeballs. If it had been remotely close to Halloween at the time, then maybe I could have found a way to dismiss it. But it happened May or June of that year, so I have no idea what was going on. Edit. I photoshopped an example of how I remember her eyes looking. Story 25. I was maybe 10 years old and my grandma had just died. I didn't really know her because she had spent most of my young life in a nursing home and often didn't remember who I was when I went to visit. But when I visited, she would always rub my back. It was sort of like an instinctual comfort thing. She did it to all her kids and grandkids. For about a year after she died, I would be sitting in my room at night, alone, and start to feel someone rubbing my back like she used to. It freaked me out until one night when I acknowledged it and said, "Thank you, Grandma." It stopped after that and I never felt it again. Story 26. I've shared this story on Reddit before, and I've been thinking about a lot lately. It's not exactly a scary thing I saw, but I still wonder about it all the time, so I'll copy and paste here. My best friend and I would always talk about crazy dreams we had. Never thought much of it until he told me about one where he got hit by a car and died. We were about 15, 16 when he told me about the dream. We were into conspiracies, stuff like aliens, paranormal, lucid dreaming, so we'd talk about stuff like that a lot. And he died right before he would have turned 20. He said he was riding a skateboard wearing all black when the car hit him and could see everyone at his funeral. He even said his crush was at his funeral and laughed about it. He just kept going on about how it was so real, and it really shook me up until eventually I forgot about it. Then a few years later, after I'd long forgot about the dream he told me about, it happened for real. His crush was at his funeral. He did get hit by a car and die. He was wearing all black like in the dream, his work clothes, and he was riding my skateboard. It was all true. I still don't know what to make of it all. Every single detail I remember from his dream came true, and I'm sure there's parts of it he told me that I don't remember. I felt crazy. I didn't tell anyone about. I just don't know why or how he saw it happen in his dream and think, what if he never told me about it? It just left me with so many questions, but I guess now I have proof at least to myself that our souls go on after we die. I just wish I knew why he experienced that dream and told me about it. Like there had to be some kind of reason. I just think about how I wouldn't believe this story if I hadn't experienced it for myself. Has anyone ever experienced anything similar? Story 27. It was Easter morning and I was in elementary school at the time. After our Easter egg hunt, I found one of my toy hairbrushes that I used on my dolls. It was completely flattened and had thick yellow hair stuck in all the bristles as if an animal of some sort used it. This definitely wasn't human hair, and even if it was, everyone in my family had brown hair. We had no pets, and my parents didn't believe it was my toy brush when I showed them. We were all genuinely shocked. It was found in our living room on Easter morning, and to this day, my parents deny having anything to do with it. So yes, I am 30 years old and low-key think the Easter Bunny is real. That being said, I won't put it to chance when I have kids. I'll still buy them Easter eggs in case he's not real, haha. Story 28. Not sure if it counts, but when I was a kid, my stepdad was drunk and high and thought that one of his friends had both ripped him off and was hitting on my mom behind his back. I don't know how true any of that might actually be, but he grabbed a wooden oar and chased him out of the house and down the street. The thing is, I never saw that guy again, and we lived in a small town. I hope he just left. But I don't know for sure either way. Story 29. A comment I made in a thread maybe a month ago. Was looking out my bedroom window late one summer night at stars. I noticed an oddly colored flashing star that was 100% moving. If you've ever seen a ping pong ball held up suspended by an airflow, that was the type of movement. I'd say bubbling is good description. This had me weirded out, so I pull out my phone and start recording it. Maybe 10 seconds later, the most terrifying thing I have ever seen happens. A fucking beam of white light, cylindrical, and bright, not as much as a helicopter spot search, but a high-power flashlight appears in my neighbor's backyard. Like a literal beam from heaven, maybe 8 feet in diameter and from the blackness of space as far up as I could see. No source or anything visible. This light is first pointing in the center of their backyard, which is maybe 45 feet from my face. My window is on side of house at rear, then it starts frantically moving around as if it was searching for something. I felt this in my whole body immediately. I was like, it's looking for me. Stomach on floor. Then it moves up the side yard, towards front of house still in neighbor property, but now only 20 feet from where I'm standing. It then diverted onto the side of their house and scanned up the wall to a window. directly across from me, 15 to 20 feet. I slammed my window down closed, the blackout curtains, and quickly left my room and went to a bathroom in center of house with no window visible. This was so fucking terrifying and world-changing that I can't express with words. It 100% happened and I felt it in my bones and everything. I had this feeling that it was a warning or something, like, don't film or bring attention to me. Us. It had to know that it wasn't my window and was trying to frighten me. If it detected me filming with a phone from a star that's not our sun position in the sky, far as, it 100% knew exactly where I was. The neighbor's window wouldn't have even had a vantage point of it due to how it was positioned. I was viewing it 45 degrees over their two-story house, so the neighbor in that window, direct facing my window, couldn't physically see it or where it was. That and the guy feeling I mentioned are why I feel it was warning or intentionally scaring the life out of me. It put on a "We are searching for you" show right in front of me, intentionally to dissuade me from giving it focused attention. Filming. It worked too, if that's the actual case. I still haven't scanned night skies since then, and that was 2-3 years ago. And I used to really look up at night for stuff a lot. Aside from altering my worldview's perspective completely, I knew now that something unimaginable to me exists, and it watched me watching it. It made me not afraid of night and the stuff up high, but motivated to not be doing it anymore. A surreal and insane experience. Thinking about it makes me get chills and tear up. Not sadness, but a feeling of overwhelmingness and having a life-altering revelation. I've never told this publicly. I was feeling afraid to for a long time. Almost 3 years, and only my wife, parents, and a single friend heard this. Seeing this video made me think of it immediately. Like I was seeing something being targeted by something impossible, unknown, just like I felt. The event from first appears to it, covering the neon or window, and me slamming window curtains was maybe 7 or 9 seconds. No more than 10 and longer than 5. It's impossible to know exactly, but I'm pretty certain my range is right on it. The only other thing it could have been, still equally if not more terrifying, was an altered image of reality being uploaded to my mind. As in, I and only I would have seen this. And if anyone happened to have view of the area it happened, nothing odd would have been seen by them. IDK, crazy though. I can't believe I'm actually posing it finally. Story 30. Honestly, the scariest thing I've ever seen is people who support Trump in spite of all the threats and garbage coming out of the mouth of this pedophile, rapist, convicted felon. Story 31. Was driving home with my family late after a day of skiing. My father likes to drive too fast for the weather, and it was just starting to snow heavily. We hit a patch of black ice, spinning us out and sliding us towards what would be a 30-40 foot, almost vertical drop down into a line. Before we reached the drop-off, the area between the front and rear passenger side door completely crumpled enough to where we could see outside, stopping us on the shoulder of the roadway. Weird part is that when we go out, there was nothing there to hit. No guardrails, no street signs, nothing. The even stranger part is that it did not feel like a crash. I have been in some. We went from 65 mph to dead stop with the force of what feels like pulling into a parking space. No jolt, no bang, just spinning, then immediate stop. Another foot, and we would have been over the edge and likely dead. When we looked at the car, it looked like what I'd expect to see in an Avengers movie if Iron Man put his hand out to stop the car. It's really hard to put in words, but I'm convinced a higher power stepped in. Story 32. 2 days after my wife passed in 2021, my kids and I were sitting in our living room watching South Park, which she hated. It was the episode where the boys are trying to build a stairwell or ladder to heaven to get something back from Kenny's dead. The episode had Alan Jackson in it, my wife's favorite singer from her youth. Anyway, we're sitting there, and Life 360 on MN and both the kids' phones goes off. Mom had left home, except her phone was on the counter in the kitchen. I thought it was just a weird glitch till I saw the location was the home of one of her Girl Scouts. A little disabled girl who my wife adored. I guess she wanted to go visit her one last time. It stayed there about 10 minutes and then arrived back at home and never did anything like that again. Story 33. In 2002, I came home from college to the Cincinnati area and met up with a couple of high school friends. We were driving around in northern Kentucky around 9 p.m. It was unusually foggy that night, low-hanging clouds, and the tops of the hills were completely hidden in the fog. I was riding in the back seat and my two friends were in the front. Just after we crossed the bridge, I saw a light up in the fog, and I assumed it was a helicopter, but that immediately made no sense since it was so foggy. Couldn't be a helicopter. There would be no visibility. I pointed it out to them and they saw it, but because they were in the front seat, they weren't able to look out the back window, which is how I had the best view of it. I kept reporting what I saw. They eventually pulled over, and we watched for a minute, but then the light had disappeared. After waiting a couple minutes, we decided to keep moving. A few minutes later, it came back. The light was visible, and as I was watching, it was getting brighter and appeared to be getting closer to the hilltop, to the edge of the fog. And that's when it happened. I saw the edge of this round, dark thing pop out of the fog and hover there a little, almost like Jack Torrance's face sticking through the door on The Shining. I didn't see where the lights were being emitted from. They were still back far enough that they were in the cloud cover, but whatever I was looking at was a dark, round surface. Obviously, my mind went straight to UFO. It's still inexplicable. I have no logical explanation for what it was or what it could be. A blimp is the best thing I could compare to, except this thing disappeared back into the clouds and the light went off. It wasn't until the last couple of years when the movie Nope came out that I kind of had a wee panic attack at the movies. The imagery used in that movie is very similar to what I saw that night. Story 34. I love these threads, but then there's always the Debbie Downers that have to swoop in and try to come up with some mundane explanation. Just let us enjoy some creepy stories. Lowell. Story 35. Giant blue, almond-shaped, front-facing eyes glowing in the dark through a barbed wire fence. I lived on a forest property in a country with no large predatory animals. This was after huge bushfires, so something that lived in the forest must have been flushed to the outskirts where we lived. Even the insects had gone dead silent, and flight, fight, or freeze instinct was overwhelming. Local indigenous tribe claim I encountered a bunyip. I have no idea what it was, but I've never been so terrified.